Eleanor White sat in the small hospital waiting room, the sterile smell of disinfectant mixing with the faint scent of flowers from the corner vase. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly above, and the clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward 10 a.m. The appointed time for her appointment. She checked her watch again. A silver timepiece that had belonged to her late husband, feeling a tightening in her chest. "Where is Mark?" she murmured under her breath, her voice almost swallowed by the quiet hum of the room. The receptionist glanced up, offering a polite smile that failed to soothe Eleanor's unease. The waiting area was nearly empty except for a couple of elderly patients reading magazines with distracted attention. Eleanor's hands rested on her lap, knitting her fingers together, the subtle tremor betraying her calm exterior. Minutes stretched into half an hour. Each ding of the elevator made her look up, hoping to see her son's familiar face. None appeared. The anticipation, the silent expectation of seeing someone she had raised and nurtured, began to twist into a hollow ache. Just as a wave of frustration threatened to surface, the door at the end of the hallway opened and Victoria White entered. She moved with a polished composure, her blonde hair perfectly in place despite the morning rush, her heels clicking lightly against the linoleum floor. Eleanor noted the subtle smirk on her face, the way she carried herself as if the room belonged entirely to her, and a quiet sense of alarm prickled Eleanor's skin. Victoria approached the reception desk, exchanged a few words, and then turned, her gaze landing briefly on Eleanor. There was a calculated brightness in her eyes, a performance of concern that felt out of place, almost theatrical. Eleanor straightened in her chair, adjusting the cardigan over her shoulders, and took a slow, deliberate breath. She did not rise. She did not speak. She simply watched, observing the minute details, the way Victoria's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the counter, the slight tilt of her head, the careful placement of her purse. Every movement seemed intentional, a quiet assertion of control in the absence of her son. Eleanor's mind wandered to the days leading up to this moment, the messages from Mark that were unusually brief, the cancellations, the excuses. She recalled preparing for this visit, making sure she had her blood pressure medication, her water bottle, the paperwork from her last checkup meticulously organized. Each preparation now seemed overshadowed by Mark's absence, a weight pressing on her chest heavier than the morning's humidity. She considered leaving, the thought fleeting, but her years had taught her patience, the kind that allowed one to observe before reacting. She allowed herself a subtle survey of the hallway, noting the faces of the passing staff, the patients who came and went, the squeak of a nurse's shoes on the polished floor. The waiting room's bland color scheme and clinical posters suddenly felt oppressive, every detail exaggerated in her awareness. Eleanor reflected on the quiet moments with Mark, the mornings when he would accompany her to appointments, the brief handshakes, the offhand remarks that used to make her smile. Now, absence and silence replaced those interactions. Victoria's presence intensified the contrast. Eleanor's heart remained steady, but her mind worked swiftly, cataloging every nuance, every small sign of calculated attention. There was something else in Victoria's approach, a purpose beneath the composed exterior, and Eleanor felt it, a subtle tightening, a quiet understanding that this visit might not be what it seemed. As Victoria settled into a chair across from her, Eleanor's gaze held, unflinching, noting the slight stiffness in Victoria's posture, the way her eyes flickered briefly toward the hallway and back. Eleanor's silence was not passivity. It was preparation, a gathering of awareness, an internal readiness for what might unfold. She reminded herself of the lessons life had taught her, the quiet endurance, the observation before response, the ticking clock, the distant murmur of the hospital intercom, and the soft shuffle of feet in the corridor became the background to Eleanor's vigilant stillness. She adjusted her hands again, smoothing the wrinkles of her cardigan, taking in a slow, steady breath, and allowed the moment to expand fully, capturing every detail, every subtle inflection, every minute gesture. Eleanor was aware, fully, that this day held significance, that the absence of her son and the presence of Victoria carried a weight she had yet to measure, and she was ready to witness it unfold. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, her hands resting neatly on her lap, fingers interlaced as she surveyed the waiting room with quiet attentiveness. The subtle noises of the hospital formed a soft, constant backdrop, the distant beeping of machines, the muted conversations of nurses in the hallway, the occasional squeak of a cart on polished tile. She noticed the small details she had often overlooked before, the faint scuff marks along the baseboards, the way the light fell unevenly across the chairs, the slight hum in the ventilation above. Victoria adjusted her purse on her lap, leaning back slightly, and Eleanor observed the movement, noting the way her eyes flicked toward the clock each time the second hand advanced. There was a precision in her gestures, a careful placement that seemed intentional rather than coincidental. Eleanor recalled how she had always prided herself on noticing these subtleties in people, the tiny tells that revealed character and intent. She allowed herself a quiet reflection on the past weeks, the small changes in Mark's calls, the delays, the interruptions, the moments that felt slightly off but had been easy to dismiss at first. Now, in the sterile brightness of the waiting room, those memories aligned with Victoria's poised presence to create a pattern Eleanor could not ignore. Her thoughts wandered to the preparation she had done for today, the printed list of medications, her insurance paperwork organized in neat folders, her blood pressure readings logged meticulously for the appointment. Each careful step she had taken was met with silence, the absence of her son, and the calculating attention of Victoria. Eleanor's pulse remained steady, yet beneath her calm exterior, a quiet resolve was forming. She would watch, observe, and allow events to unfold, gathering information as she had always done in moments of uncertainty. The clock continued its persistent ticking, each second marking both anticipation and an unspoken tension. She noted the subtle shift in Victoria's posture as a nurse passed by, the brief glance exchanged with a passing orderly, the way her lips pressed lightly together as she focused on a distant point. Eleanor catalogued these observations silently, mentally storing them for later contemplation. Outside, a nurse wheeled a cart loaded with paperwork past the waiting area, and Eleanor's gaze followed it with a detached interest, noting the way it rattled slightly, the uneven distribution of forms on the top tray. She realized that everything in this room had a rhythm, pattern, and that she had come to understand it fully in these few moments. Her mind briefly reflected on the relationship she had maintained with Mark over the years, the early mornings, the shared breakfasts, the small, unremarkable conversations that once had carried warmth. Now, the absence of these routines left a hollow space, one that Victoria's meticulous presence seemed to fill with an uncomfortable precision. Eleanor's attention returned to Victoria, noting a slight hesitation in her hand as she reached for her phone, a pause that revealed a trace of uncertainty beneath the polished exterior. Eleanor's lips pressed together subtly, not in judgment but in acknowledgement, aware that even the smallest gestures carried meaning. She allowed the silence to expand, observing the interplay of attention and inattention, the quiet signals that passed between people even when no words were spoken. Each observation strengthened Eleanor's awareness, her capacity to anticipate, and her quiet determination to maintain composure. She shifted slightly, adjusting the cardigan over her shoulders, feeling the smooth fabric under her hands, a grounding sensation amid the tension, the hum of the ventilation, the distant murmur of footsteps, the occasional clink of a coffee cup from the small corner station. All became elements of a scene she was fully present within, each detail noted, catalogued, and held in careful consideration. Eleanor's breathing remained steady, slow, deliberate, and her eyes, calm and discerning, never left Victoria for more than a heartbeat. She understood the dynamics unfolding, recognized the undercurrents of attention and avoidance, and prepared herself mentally for the moments yet to come, holding to the quiet certainty that observation was her first measure of control. Eleanor adjusted her posture slightly, feeling the cool vinyl of the waiting room chair against her legs. The soft murmur of distant voices in the corridor created a rhythm that she could measure her patience against. Victoria shifted her weight, leaning forward for a moment as if to peer down the hallway, then straightened with a controlled grace. Eleanor's eyes followed her every subtle movement, noting how her fingers drummed lightly against the edge of her purse, the precise tilt of her head, the fleeting glance toward the clock. The room was otherwise quiet, save for the occasional scrape of a janitor's cart and the faint rustle of paper from the reception desk. Eleanor's thoughts turned inward as she reflected on the years she had spent managing her household, overseeing appointments, and ensuring the well-being of her family. Each memory of small gestures of care now seemed juxtaposed against this moment, where absence and subtle manipulation took precedence. She noted the slight stiffness in Victoria's back, the way her lips pressed together briefly when she spoke to the receptionist, and the careful placement of her notes and documents in a neat stack. Eleanor's mind catalogued these details without judgment, simply observing and retaining information. She remembered Mark's hurried calls in the past week, his voice clipped and distracted, the cancellations of lunches and visits, the postponements of simple errands, and now, the complete absence at the hospital. Eleanor's breathing remained even, slow, a deliberate measure to steady herself. She reflected on how she had always prepared meticulously for such visits: water, medications, insurance cards, and notes on her symptoms. The lack of acknowledgement of this effort from her son created a hollow space that Victoria's controlled presence filled with an unnerving precision. Eleanor's attention returned to the subtle exchange Victoria had with the receptionist, a brief conversation in hushed tones, followed by a quick adjustment of her scarf. Each small gesture felt purposeful, a quiet assertion of influence in a space Eleanor had long considered familiar and neutral. She observed the patients in the chairs across from her, the way they shuffled magazines, the slight glances exchanged with the staff, and contrasted it with the deliberate movements of Victoria, noting a difference in intent and attention. Eleanor's thoughts became methodical, each observation connecting to prior experiences and small inconsistencies she had noted over the past weeks. The absence of Mark in this critical moment crystallized a larger pattern, one she had not fully acknowledged until now. Eleanor's gaze softened slightly as she considered the quiet endurance required to navigate these dynamics. She allowed her awareness to expand, noting the position of chairs, the light across the floor, the gentle hum of the heating system, all elements she catalogued as part of the environment and as part of her understanding of the unfolding scenario. Eleanor adjusted her cardigan, the familiar texture grounding her, and let her gaze rest steadily on Victoria, fully aware of the subtle signals, pauses, and the unspoken tensions. She did not react outwardly. She remained composed, her mind quietly assessing, absorbing, and preparing. Each passing second reinforced her resolve, reminding her that observation was her first instrument of control, patience her shield, and quiet vigilance her tool to understand what was truly happening in this carefully orchestrated moment. Eleanor felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere as the morning progressed, the fluorescent lights casting sharp edges on the walls of the hospital waiting area. The hum of the ventilation blended with the quiet shuffle of feet along the linoleum floor, each sound punctuating the stillness of the room. Victoria remained seated, her posture impeccable, yet Eleanor could detect the faint tightening in her shoulders, the micro-expression that betrayed a slight impatience beneath the composed exterior. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, noting every small gesture, every fleeting glance, every calculated pause, cataloging them meticulously in her mind. She reflected on the past months, the subtle changes in Mark's behavior, the way he had begun to defer decisions to Victoria, the polite but distant tone in his phone calls, the delays and cancellations that had accumulated into a pattern she could no longer ignore. Eleanor recalled the careful preparation she had made for this day, the printed list of medications, insurance cards neatly stacked, a notepad with questions for the physician, a water bottle filled to the precise measurement she preferred. Each detail was a testament to her diligence, and yet, the absence of her son amplified the tension in the room, leaving space for Victoria's poised presence to dominate. Eleanor considered the patients around her, the quiet murmurs, the shifting magazines, the subtle interactions between staff and visitors, and contrasted it with Victoria's controlled engagement, noting how her movements and attention were purposeful, directed, and deliberate. She observed the slight brush of Victoria's hand along the edge of the table, the way she adjusted her scarf with measured precision, the deliberate pacing of her words when speaking to the receptionist. Eleanor catalogued all of it, understanding that each small action carried intent and significance. Her thoughts drifted momentarily to her own life, to the countless mornings spent preparing for appointments, managing schedules, and ensuring the well-being of her family with careful attention, all the while expecting that her efforts would be acknowledged or reciprocated. The absence of Mark now stood in stark contrast to those past routines, and Eleanor's awareness of this absence heightened her observation and sharpened her perception. She allowed herself to notice the faint creak of the elevator doors, the quiet footsteps approaching and receding in the corridor, the subtle interplay of light across the linoleum floor, all forming a backdrop to the unfolding dynamics between her and Victoria. Eleanor adjusted her cardigan slightly, feeling the familiar texture, grounding herself in the moment, and let her eyes rest calmly on Victoria, who shifted in her seat, a slight narrowing of her gaze betraying the concentration behind her composed expression. Eleanor's mind quietly assessed, recording, anticipating, and preparing for the moments ahead. She remained outwardly still, letting the environment, the sounds, the movements, and the subtle signals from Victoria provide a comprehensive understanding of the current situation. Each second passed with deliberate slowness, Eleanor measuring the flow of time, the interactions, and the silent cues, building a full awareness of the room, of the people, and of the intentions that lay beneath the polished surfaces, reinforcing her resolve to remain patient, observant, and fully in control of her own presence. Eleanor shifted her attention slightly, observing Victoria as she organized a small stack of paperwork on the chair beside her. Each sheet was placed with meticulous care, aligned at perfect right angles, the precise folds and edges suggesting a deliberate awareness of order and control. Eleanor noted the faint reflection of light on the polished floor, the way it caught on the corner of a clipboard Victoria held, tracing a line along the edge before setting it down gently. Eleanor's mind traced back to similar patterns she had noticed over the past weeks: subtle manipulations, careful timing, the measured placement of objects, gestures, and glances, all creating a quiet assertion of influence. She recalled the mornings spent arranging medication schedules, confirming appointments, making lists of questions for physicians, and ensuring that every detail of her day was accounted for. A diligence that had once been met with appreciation, now largely ignored. The absence of Mark lingered like a shadow over the waiting room, amplifying the significance of Victoria's presence. Each calculated movement under scrutiny, each soft-spoken word weighted with intention. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the slight tilt of Victoria's head as she spoke to a passing nurse, noting the inflection in her voice, the careful pause between words, the way her eyes flickered briefly to the hallway and back. Eleanor catalogued each movement, silently creating a map of attention, intent, and timing. She recalled moments from the past, the dinners, the appointments, the small gestures of consideration that had woven a fabric of routine and trust, now contrasted against the current dynamic where absence, anticipation, and subtle control dominated the space. The ambient sounds, the distant hum of medical equipment, the muted tones of conversations, the soft squeak of a chair on the polished floor, each contributed to the quiet tension Eleanor measured with precision. She adjusted the cardigan over her shoulders again, the familiar weight grounding her, and allowed herself a calm observation of the interplay of focus, tension, and control in the room. Eleanor's posture remained poised, hands gently folded, eyes steady and discerning. As she followed the slight shift of Victoria's gaze toward the clock, the brief touch of her fingers against the edge of a table, the careful placement of a pen on top of a folded sheet of paper, Eleanor's awareness expanded to encompass the entire environment. The alignment of chairs, the angle of sunlight through the windows, the movement of other visitors in the space, the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor, all providing context to the quiet orchestration unfolding before her. Each detail reinforced Eleanor's understanding, each microgesture a piece of a larger picture she had come to recognize and anticipate. Her breathing remained deliberate and controlled, a rhythmic anchor in the midst of subtle manipulations, a quiet testament to her patience and observation. Eleanor's attention returned to Victoria, absorbing each nuanced motion, each calculated pause, each faint shift in expression, all while maintaining the appearance of stillness, composure, and quiet presence, ready to respond with careful consideration to the unfolding situation and the intentions it revealed. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, allowing a moment of calm to settle over her as she continued to observe Victoria with careful attention. The subtle movement of Victoria's hand as she adjusted the stack of papers on the seat beside her drew Eleanor's eyes. The slight tilt of her wrist, the brief pause before the next deliberate motion, all noted with quiet precision. The room around them remained calm, punctuated only by the distant echo of a nurse's cart and the soft murmur of conversations in the corridor, each sound folding into the background of Eleanor's awareness. Her thoughts traced the weeks leading to this moment, the small inconsistencies in Mark's messages, the unusual timing of appointments, the delays, and the subtle shifts in communication that had begun to form a pattern she could now clearly recognize. Eleanor allowed herself a slow, measured breath, focusing on the tactile sensation of her hands resting on her lap, the texture of her cardigan, the familiar weight and warmth grounding her in the present. She considered the environment carefully, the alignment of chairs, the polished floors reflecting the morning light, the soft shadows cast by the overhead fluorescent panels, the occasional click of Victoria's heels on the floor. Each detail fed into a mental map Eleanor constructed of movement, intention, and attention. She recalled her own preparations for this day, the careful organization of documents, the precise recording of her symptoms, the detailed notes for the physician, all of which were conducted with the expectation of support from her son, now conspicuously absent. The contrast heightened her focus, sharpening her awareness of the subtle assertions of control exercised by Victoria. Eleanor observed a fleeting hesitation in Victoria's expression, the brief narrowing of her eyes as she glanced toward the hallway, the slight pause in her posture before settling again into composed elegance. Eleanor catalogued every microgesture silently, without outward reaction, building an understanding of the dynamic in the room and the intentions she could infer from these small cues. Her mind wandered to previous experiences, moments where she had learned to measure, observe, and respond with calm precision, allowing patience and quiet vigilance to guide her assessment before any action. The distant hum of ventilation, the gentle shuffle of footsteps, and the faint sound of papers shifting created a rhythm that Eleanor integrated into her perception, giving context to the interplay between presence, absence, and intention. She shifted her focus back to Victoria, noting the exact sequence of movements, the careful placement of a pen, the alignment of papers, and the way her eyes scanned the room, each detail reinforcing Eleanor's understanding. Eleanor's own posture remained still, composed, grounded in the weight of awareness, her breathing slow and deliberate, each inhale and exhale a measured rhythm that mirrored her steady observation. She allowed the room, the people, and the subtle exchanges to fill her senses, understanding that each moment, each gesture, each nuance provided information, and she held herself in quiet readiness, fully aware of the unfolding situation, and prepared to respond with deliberate clarity when the time came. Eleanor remained seated, her eyes tracing the subtle movements of Victoria as she rearranged a few papers with careful precision, the faint click of the pen against the clipboard echoing softly in the otherwise quiet waiting room. The fluorescent lights above cast a cool glare on the polished floor, reflecting Eleanor's composed posture. Her hands gently folded in her lap as she observed with steady, measured attention each shift of Victoria's gaze, each careful tilt of her head, and every slight adjustment of her clothing was catalogued silently, building a mental map of intention and awareness. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the small discrepancies in Mark's communication over the past weeks, the hurried phone calls, the delayed responses, the subtle changes in his tone, and now, his complete absence, leaving Victoria's orchestrated presence to dominate the space. She adjusted her cardigan slightly, the fabric brushing against her arms in a familiar, grounding sensation, while her gaze never wavered from the small details that revealed more than words ever could: the distant hum of the ventilation, the shuffle of shoes on the linoleum, the occasional beeping of a machine in a nearby room, all blended into the background, a quiet rhythm against which Eleanor measured every nuance in the room. Her mind briefly reflected on past appointments, the care she had taken to prepare, the meticulous documentation, the lists of questions for the physician, all of which had once been acknowledged by Mark, now absent, leaving the subtle power dynamics between Eleanor and Victoria fully in focus. Eleanor noted the slight hesitation in Victoria's fingers as she touched the edge of the clipboard, the brief pause before arranging the papers again, the way her eyes scanned the room with practiced attention. Each microgesture revealed intention, a careful assertion of control in Eleanor's absence of distraction from Mark. Eleanor catalogued each moment silently, her breathing steady and slow, the rhythm grounding her awareness and patience. She recalled prior experiences where observation and stillness had revealed more than confrontation, the quiet collection of information before deciding on action. Eleanor's attention swept across the room once more, noting the angle of chairs, the positioning of the reception desk, the soft reflection of light from the windows, the subtle interplay of shadows on the floor, all contributing to the context of what was unfolding before her. Victoria shifted slightly, brushing a stray hair behind her ear, a minimal movement that Eleanor registered as a signal of calculated composure. Eleanor remained outwardly still, her mind actively analyzing, connecting, and anticipating, integrating each observed nuance into a coherent understanding of the situation. The room, the sounds, the subtle signals, all became a framework through which Eleanor measured control, patience, and timing. She allowed herself to settle further into her observation, aware of the quiet tension, the absence and presence, the unspoken assertions of intent, ready to respond with deliberate clarity when the moment required, fully attuned to the flow of events, the gestures, and the subtle orchestration of the day unfolding around her. Eleanor shifted her attention once again, feeling the subtle rhythm of the waiting room settle around her as she observed the passage of time with quiet vigilance. The distant hum of the ventilation, the soft echo of footsteps along the linoleum, and the gentle murmur of the receptionist became a steady backdrop against which Eleanor measured each movement, each gesture, and each expression in the room. Victoria adjusted the stack of papers beside her once more, her movements deliberate, precise, and purposeful, as if each small action carried a message that only the observant could decode. Eleanor noted the brief narrowing of Victoria's eyes as she glanced toward the corridor, the gentle tap of her fingers on the edge of the clipboard, the slight tilt of her head, and catalogued each detail silently, allowing them to form a complete map of attention and intent. Eleanor's mind wandered briefly to her own careful preparations for the appointment, her folders arranged with exact order, her notes on medication and symptoms meticulously checked, her water bottle filled to the precise measurement she preferred, all the details a testament to her diligence, and now amplified in significance by the absence of her son. She reflected on the past weeks, the subtle changes in Mark's behavior, the delays in rescheduling, the clipped tone in phone conversations, and realized how these small patterns aligned with the current orchestrated presence of Victoria. Eleanor allowed herself a slow, measured breath, grounding herself in the texture of her cardigan against her arms, the slight warmth of the fabric a quiet anchor amid the tension. The subtle glances Victoria exchanged with the receptionist, the brief attention to the clock, and the calculated positioning of her notes all contributed to a silent assertion of control, a quiet choreography that Eleanor registered fully without outward reaction. Eleanor's eyes swept across the room, noting the faint reflections of light on the polished floor, the alignment of chairs, the soft shadows cast by the morning sun filtering through the windows, and the gentle movements of other patients who passed by, each element adding context to the careful orchestration unfolding before her. She considered each microgesture, each pause, each unspoken cue, integrating them into a comprehensive understanding of the dynamics at play, fully aware of the tension created by her son's absence and the deliberate presence of Victoria. Eleanor adjusted her posture slightly, allowing her awareness to expand, holding herself in quiet readiness, her breathing slow, deliberate, and controlled, every inhalation and exhalation a steadying force as she catalogued the unfolding situation. She observed the subtle signs of focus and intent in Victoria's movements, the brief hesitation, the deliberate pacing of gestures, and allowed the quiet patience of observation to sharpen her understanding of what was happening in the room. Eleanor's attention remained unwavering, a silent sentinel, fully attuned to the interplay of presence, absence, and intention, prepared to respond with calculated clarity and measured composure to the events as they continued to unfold before her, each small detail reinforcing her quiet vigilance and steady resolve. Eleanor finally shifted her gaze toward the corridor, the quiet anticipation in the waiting room stretching each second into a measured beat. The distant sounds of footsteps and soft conversations reached her with clarity, each one offering context to the unfolding situation. Victoria straightened, placing her hands lightly on her lap, her composure precise and deliberate. Yet Eleanor could detect the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight lift of her chin, the controlled exhale before she spoke softly to the receptionist. Eleanor observed without interruption, cataloging every nuanced gesture, every carefully calculated movement, the brief glances, the micropauses, the way Victoria's fingers traced the edge of the clipboard before returning to her purse. She thought back on the morning she had carefully prepared for appointments like this, the neatly organized papers, her notes on medications, the questions she had written down to ensure no detail was forgotten. Mark's absence amplified the significance of Victoria's presence, highlighting the delicate balance of control, intention, and influence within the room. Eleanor adjusted her cardigan, the familiar texture grounding her, while her eyes never left the subtle shifts in posture, the precise placement of objects, and the brief, purposeful gestures that revealed more than words could express. She reflected on the series of small discrepancies she had noted in Mark's behavior, the hurried calls, the delayed responses, the subtle tone changes, each piece now aligning with the dynamics Victoria subtly orchestrated. The soft hum of the ventilation, the occasional beeping of medical equipment, and the distant shuffle of a janitor's cart all blended seamlessly into the background, providing a rhythmic cadence that Eleanor matched with her steady awareness. She traced the room with her eyes, noting the reflections of sunlight on the polished floor, the shadows cast by chairs, the alignment of documents on the reception desk, and the quiet movements of other patients, each element integrated into her assessment of the unfolding scenario. Victoria's slight tilt of the head, the momentary pause in her movements, the deliberate placement of a pen on top of the folded papers, all contributed to a subtle choreography of attention that Eleanor understood fully. Her mind worked silently, connecting gestures, timing, and environmental cues into a coherent understanding of the situation, preparing for any eventuality without overt reaction. Eleanor breathed slowly, deliberately, grounding herself with each inhalation and exhalation, fully aware of the unspoken dynamics, the absence of her son, and the quiet assertion of influence Victoria maintained in this space. She remained poised, her focus unwavering, observing the interplay of presence and absence, the subtle signals of intent, and the rhythm of the environment, fully attuned to each microgesture and ready to act with clarity and composed judgment as the morning continued to unfold around her.